offer you the vulnerability challenge. How can you choose to show up in your life in a more vulnerable way? What are you willing to challenge yourself on? In my opinion, vulnerability is one of the sexiest qualities there is in an individual, that and transparency. Because in order to show up transparently, there's a prerequisite for honesty. And honesty is one of my #1 sexiest qualities in kindness in an individual. How comfortable are you in your vulnerability? How vulnerable do you perceive yourself to be? And are you willing to be? And how often do you change the levels of your vulnerability depending on the situations that you're in or the people you're with? Do you perceive that vulnerability is a weakness, or do you perceive it as a strength? Personally, I perceive vulnerability as one of our greatest strengths because it is a choice. In order to be vulnerable, we have to choose to begin to delayer the masking that we may put up in order to protect ourselves from emotional vulnerability and truth. We have to let go of the defense mechanisms and armor that we utilize and have built up over time because of the relative trauma, wounding, and harm we have experienced throughout our life. We have to begin to dissolve the layers of our ego. And all of this we must do for ourselves first, and then we can choose to offer this to another individual. In order to be authentically vulnerable, there's a proponent of emotional intelligence, there's wisdom, and there's quite healthy boundaries. Otherwise, it falls into an unhealthy naivete. So if you're choosing to be vulnerable, you've made a willful, conscious decision to begin to dissolve and strip away your ego, to first recognize and work on letting go of the variety of defense mechanisms that most individuals build up through time, and to allow yourself to take off any mask that you might be seduced into applying so that others don't see you for your truth. This could be simply you being more transparent with yourself about your own emotional state. Do you have a tremendous amount of stories that you've created about why you shouldn't connect with this individual, or why it's not healthy for you to do this because it makes you feel some type of way, so you have to create a story around it? Have you been wanting to approach somebody for a long time, but you're too scared to do it because it requires authentic vulnerability? Are you often personalizing and feeling wounded by other people in your life and therefore blaming and putting up defense mechanisms? Or are your emotions way too dangerous to approach, so you're much more comfortable in your logical mind and reasoning? All of these areas are places where you could offer yourself more vulnerability. You don't even have to expose this to other people. It's often the case that we judge our emotions. We're not comfortable in these feelings, so we have to overlay them with why it's not okay, or they shouldn't be there, or why they're there, creating more stories. But why don't you adopt the perspective and the mantra of dirt is dirty? What do I mean by this? Months ago, I was looking at perception and stories as opposed to reality and fact. Now, I don't care who you are, all of us have a propensity to color the reality with our own perception and story, which overlays it with our own subconscious inadequacies, defense mechanisms, and belief systems. I was sitting there grumbling and ruminating in my own space of how the room I was in was dirty and I didn't like it. It made me feel icky and I was judging it. And then I realized this is a perception, because the reality is dirt is very obviously just dirty. I don't have to think any type of way about it. Dirt is dirty. So if I don't want dirt to be in the space, I can clean it, because that's the nature of dirt in its own regard, and it's allowed to be dirty. So how are you perceiving your own experience as something that it's actually not, because it makes you uncomfortable? Your uncomfortability will expose where you're not ready to be vulnerable. Are you brave enough to maybe be more vulnerable to the individuals in your life? Now, something that I've witnessed in individuals that are not comfortable in their vulnerability, I find that they often judge vulnerability as a weakness. They often will judge it, exploit it, and use it as their own justification of a story that they project onto the vulnerable individual of why maybe that person is always indulging their emotions, or they're holding on to the past, or they're just weak and don't have enough strength because they're not showing up with more ego and masking. And I see that this is a really intriguing dynamic that they overlay onto somebody else. But it's really just a reflection of their trepidation, their fear of vulnerability. Because after all, it requires a tremendous amount of courage and bravery to be emotionally honest with ourselves, to show up with who we are. Most people hide their emotional truth. They think that just because they're expressing their emotions to both themselves and another individual, this is coming off as weak, or that maybe they want more from another person, as opposed to just allowing themselves to be honest and transparent in how it is that they're feeling or how they felt. In order to allow ourselves to clear out the trauma, the hurt, the pain, the harm, and the wounding that we've experienced and perceived that we've experienced, we have to be willing to play up and show ourselves and explore the emotions that we continuously harbor within our being. This requires a tremendous amount of vulnerability. Now, most people know not to show up harshly to a child because they are vulnerable in nature. They're innocent, and that's a beautiful thing. And a healthy parent knows that they can implement very healthy boundaries in a soft, gentle way. They don't have to flex. They don't have to discipline. They don't have to act as better than or superior to. They can simply offer a boundary in a way that is soft and comfortable to be received by the child. If you're implementing vulnerability in your life, then you absolutely have a healthy grasp on your own personal boundaries, and you're comfortable offering those up as a part of who you are. You don't have to share them in any defensive way. You don't have to come at somebody and offer them stipulations of what it is that you need or don't need. You simply know that this is a part of who you are. And people tend to respect healthy boundaries. And therefore, you will respect somebody else's healthy boundaries. It offers them the ability to see you transparently and then make their own decisions of what's comfortable in their regard to being able to respect your boundaries and implement their own. It keeps individuals from harboring and building resentment. So I challenge you. What is your vulnerability that you might be ready and willing to take on and press your comfortability around this? Please share it with me in the comments. Matthew Hussey once spoke about, if you're wanting to attract somebody who is emotionally open, transparent, and authentic, you must be that so as well. If you're offering up a mask, if you're holding back your emotions, if you're playing too hard to get, or not showing the truth of your being, if you're allowing your ego to take over, putting on an act, so to speak, that's exactly who both are going to believe you are and what you're going to attract back. So is that really what you want to experience in life? Though all of us have a very intricate emotional body, it makes up a tremendous amount of who we are. Our emotions have a majority ruling in how we navigate our life through our subconscious inclinations and proclivities. To what extent do you perceive that you actually are comfortable and willing to be vulnerable, both to yourself and in your life? In order to be vulnerable, it doesn't mean you're going to let go of your boundaries. Actually, to be authentically comfortable in your vulnerability, you've grown to be very strong in your boundaries. And I perceive myself to be an individual that's quite comfortable in my vulnerability. After all, I cultivate emotional intelligence. I'm able to share with myself compassion. I love myself. I connect and attune to my inner child often, and therefore I can clarify to a pretty strong degree my emotional body and how I feel and what I think. I seek to balance my emotions with my logic and my intellect. And in order to be honest with myself, I know it requires me to continue to delayer both my ego and my defense mechanisms. Adam LaDolce speaks about some of the qualities that are most desirable from men in women. One thing he was talking about was to be easily approachable, though difficult to attain. Now, this got me thinking, because I know that I'm difficult to attain. I have my own self-respects and a tremendous amount of boundaries when it comes to my own intimate life. But one thing I'm usually not is easily approachable, especially if it's somebody that I'm attracted to. Now, I had to really look at this because I've built up a tremendous amount of defense mechanisms, and I've even touted on my videos how I am unapproachable. I took this as a point of pride for many years because I judged attraction, sensuality, flirtation. After all, I was raised by an antiquatal mother who went to olive grade school with nuns. Sexuality was absolutely not a comfort zone in my household. So I had to teach myself how to delayer these false perceptions, defense mechanisms, and boundaries around being comfortable in my own sensuality. How is that healthy to navigate? Where are my boundaries? And I don't have to impose them in any harsh way. Any point of me that is uncomfortable in friendly and respectful social flirtation is simply an exposure of my own defense mechanisms because I'm not vulnerably comfortable in those scenarios. So this is how I'm challenging myself. What's your challenge? Is it simply admitting stories to yourself? Is it finally taking a deep breath and going to talk to the person that you think about all the time but wouldn't dare approach? Is it having an honest and emotionally transparent conversation with a loved one about something that's been bothering you, but you've been scared to approach it? Is it being honest with yourself about emotions you've squashed down and wouldn't dare bring up to surface? You created logical stories around why it's important to blame another individual or put up defense mechanisms, or they're not healthy for you because they make you feel some type of way. But if you're still ruminating about it, you need to explore that in order to let it go. Otherwise, we're just punishing ourselves. So write in the comments, what vulnerability are you willing to challenge yourself to help you bring forward more authentic transparency and connection to yourself and others? What is it that you can do and offer yourself that will allow you to stretch the boundaries and the comfort zone of your vulnerability? It could be simply you being more honest with yourself. What stories are you telling yourself and thinking about that are simply defense mechanisms, allowing you to create blame or distance from other individuals that are justifying why it's not emotionally safe for you, or maybe convincing yourselves that you're not having certain emotions? These stories we tell. You see, stories are never usually fact. They're often not even the reality of the situation. They're us projecting and overlaying our experience, often subconscious belief patterns, maybe even sabotage onto a situation. We're seeing things in a colored way. But if we're able to show up and just see the truth of the matter, then we can see facts. We can understand that it's not necessarily about us why an individual is acting some sort of way. When you're comfortable in your vulnerability, you're not as easily wounded because you understand that there's a bravery in being vulnerable. You feel safe enough to show up in a way where if somebody reflects back ego or harshness to you, you know that it's not wise to take it personally. This is a choice you make when you're choosing vulnerability because you're open. You understand that while the armor of defense mechanisms that you may be wearing keep you protected from certain exchanges that could be deemed threatening to you, armor is heavy. And there's only so much that you can connect with another individual through that armor. Open vulnerability and emotional truth of self allows you to get deeper. That's a very scary thing for a lot of people. Intimacy, into me see, is something that requires a lot of courage if it's not how you innately were raised, if it's not something that's natural and comfortable for you. It's going to be an aspect of your life that you may choose to work on. 20 years ago, I read a book called Love Without End by Glenda Green. In this book, she had an experience where she professes that she had Jesus appear to her. And in the book, she offers the communication exchange that she had. One thing that she said Jesus told her at a certain point is that, in fact, vulnerability is one of our greatest strengths, because we have to choose to show up in a way where if somebody wanted to come at us, we could get wounded. But it's the only way we can be completely open and authentic in ourselves to another individual and in the environment, which inevitably attracts the same. So, how are you going to show up and be more vulnerable for yourself? Please write in the comments, let me know what's comfortable for you and what's not. If you're really starting to look at yourself, what can you decide is maybe you thought you were pretty vulnerable, but the reality is you're not as much as you thought, like my revelation just a couple days ago.